Good morning. Today we are going to go over chapter 7, which is cognition. So on Tuesday we talked about memory. We've also talked about sensation and perception, and all of those concepts are part of cognition. As we learned in the last chapter, chapter 6, sensation is the first part of getting all of this outside energy and everything that's going on outside of us into our bodies so that we can work with it, into our mind so that we can work with it. So today we're going to look at some more concepts of cognition. Cognition is basically your mental activity. Oftentimes we say that cognition is thinking, and this is true, but we're going to look at some specific ideas that are part of cognition. So let's get started. So thinking is cognition. It's all of our mental activity that goes on in our brains. A lot of times we will think in mental imagery. The book gives a great example. So I want all of you to pause for just a second and think about how many windows are in your house. So I'm going to give everybody a second to think about that. So if you have a small house, you should probably already be done. If you have a bigger house, then maybe not. But I would venture to say that each of you, as you were thinking about how many windows were in your house, you probably closed your eyes and you walked through your house, or you just thought about the different rooms in your house and actually counted the windows. So a lot of times we will think using mental imagery. But another way that we think is through private speech. So in the lifespan chapter, and if you take the lifespan course, we will talk a lot about Lev Vygotsky, who is a theorist that emphasized the cognitive perspective. And he says that private speech is very important for all of us. As soon as we learn how, speech and things of that nature, until we're adults, we talk to ourselves often. Maybe you're not so crazy when you talk to yourselves, because that private speech is very helpful and it helps us to learn. So the first thing that we want to talk about whenever we look at cognition today is concepts. In the last chapter, we talked about the semantic network theory, and I showed you a slide that broke down the semantic network theory, and we looked at various concepts and how they're related to each other. So concepts is how we look at the world. The concepts that are created in our minds are the ideas that represent different classes and categories of just about anything: objects, events, activities. Some of our concepts are very formal. If we look at concepts in math or science, usually these concepts have a formal definition. So for instance, a square has certain definitions that it has to follow. It has to have 4 equal sides set together at right angles. That is a formal concept. Natural concepts are not quite as formal. They do not have necessarily a definition. When we look at natural concepts, we think of great examples of in our own experience. So for instance, if I were to say fruit, what is the first thing that comes to mind? We often think in our culture of an apple, but maybe if you are from the Caribbean area, if I were to say fruit, you might think of a coconut or something of that nature, because natural concepts are based on our own experience with the world, and they are a good representation, and that can also be the definition of a prototype. This is a good representation of a particular concept. So whenever we're looking at concepts, also, if you remember the semantic network theory, you had in that, let me see if I can pull that up real fast, that specific slide. I think that that would be a great example, a great way to illustrate the different types of concepts. So I'm going to stop sharing that screen. Okay, so let's look at the different types of concepts as represented in chapter 6 by the semantic network theory. So this slide actually shows different types of concepts and how they're related to each other. So here we have animal. Animal is considered a superordinate concept. It is very general and it represents many different things. If we move down a step, we are looking at a basic concept such as bird or fish. These bird, there are many different types of birds that fit into this category, but they're all similar. Their similarities are represented here, has wings, can fly, has feathers. Whereas if you move over to fish, this is also a basic concept that shows the characteristics or the similarities of fish. Has fins, can swim, has gills. If we move down to another category, we are looking at subordinate concepts. So from bird, we go to canary. We also look at ostrich, and we see that these are more specific. So subordinate concepts are specific, and they, we could even think of from bird, go to maybe a specific bird or a pet. If we are looking from animal to dog, maybe you look down here at the subordinate concept as a different specific breed of dog, or maybe even your specific dog that you have as a pet. So typically whenever we are looking at cognition, we think in concepts. Concepts help us to deal with the world. They help us to organize all of the information that we have outside of us into basic things that help us to deal with the world more quickly. The second idea that we look at in cognition is problem solving. So often we have to use those concepts to solve problems. And concepts give us a quick way to solve problems or deal with the world. But problem solving involves many different things. So there are many different types of problems that you may need to solve. Maybe it's a math problem that you're looking at. You're trying to do your math homework, whether it's algebra or, you know, maybe some type of statistics class or whatever. What helps us in solving those types of problems are those formal concepts. They have definitions. It shows us what we need to do. This is where we are going to be thinking algorithmically. When we think algorithmically, we are following specific steps to get to that end goal. But as you know, there are many problems in our lives that we need to solve that we don't have a book to read and show us step to step how to do things. So we may utilize different techniques to solve those problems. First might be trial and error. This is where you would utilize your skills and your experience to try out different things to reach the solution. So trial and error is one way we might solve a problem, or we may often use a heuristic. A heuristic is an educated guess at what you need to accomplish. So based on your previous experience, you may work with what you have and what you know to get to that end goal. Heuristic thinking and algorithmic thinking are opposite. So if we think in an algorithmic manner, we are following the rules, following those formal concepts. However, if we're thinking heuristically, we are looking at taking shortcuts, many different types of shortcuts. As you can see here, the representative heuristic is the assumption that any object or person sharing characteristics with the members of a particular category is also a member of that category. So that you might think by reading that definition of stereotypes. Sometimes we are criticized for using stereotypes because we often will relate stereotypes to prejudice and discrimination. However, that is not always true. Stereotypes actually can be good. As we've grown up and we have experienced the world, we have stereotypes built in to our head, our concepts, and we have to often use various types of stereotypes or heuristic thinking to deal with the world based on our own experience. Other types of heuristics, the availability heuristic is whenever we take the information that we have and we make a guess about what's going to occur. For instance, if I would have woken up this morning and heard the little pitter patter on my roof and heard some thunder, I would have guessed that I would need to dress for the day based on the idea that it's probably going to be raining outside. So even though I haven't looked out my window yet, and I have not, gone out to see if it's actually raining, I take what's available to me, which are the sounds that I'm hearing of the thunder and the pitter patter on my roof, and I think, oh, I need a raincoat today, or I need rain boots today. Sometimes we might often use the heuristic of working backward from the goal. This is where we know what we need at the end. We know what it needs to look like. So we will work backward in order to solve that problem. Or something that we do often, and I know that some of you guys might be doing this, is you break down a goal into sub-goals. So yesterday I did this thing. I decided that I am going to myself go back and take a few classes to get a certificate for my LCDC, which is a licensed chemical dependency counselor. I have a master's degree in counseling psychology, so I have a little bit of background in counseling, but I want to specifically look at chemical dependency counseling. So I started thinking to myself, and I'm actually thinking how you guys are thinking, taking this class. Started looking at my degree plan, and I started thinking, okay, this is what I need to do first. This is what I need to do second. And so I'm breaking down this entire certificate degree into, Mia, stop, into sub-goals so that it's not so overwhelming. If you need to write a term paper, y'all have a reaction assignment due on October the 16th. So what do? You look at the end result, and you think this is so overwhelming, or do you break it down into goals? So I would suggest breaking that down into goals. First of all, just to give yourself a few days to go in and find a journal article. And once again, if you need a little bit of help understanding the reaction assignment, there is a video posted on my YouTube channel. It's also posted in the announcements of the online class and the face-to-face or hybrid classes that you can go in and watch that video. So first, give yourself a few days to go find the journal article. Give yourself a few days to read the journal article. Give yourself a few days to type up the 2 paragraphs for the reaction assignment, and then give yourself a couple of days to work on the APA reference for that journal article. So there are many different situations that we can apply each of these heuristics in order to solve our problems and reach our goals. Now, unfortunately, well, let me talk about this one. Insight. I talked about this a little bit on Tuesday when we were looking at memory. Insight is another problem-solving technique that we often may not even understand. We talked about the tip of the tongue phenomenon. Whenever we are trying to think of something really hard, we seem like we're putting our brains on overload, trying to think of a solution or a person's name or whatever it might be. And then when we stop thinking about it for a while and let it rest, it's like all of a sudden that information that we need pops into our brain. And they call this an aha moment. So why does this happen? What is occurring here? So even when we are not consciously aware of things, of the problem or whatever it is we need to think of, our brain is still working. So two things could be happening. While you rest and stop trying to put so much energy into coming up with a solution, our brain is still thinking. Our cognition is still working. There are still neurons firing and things of that nature. And all of a sudden, at the right time, the right neurons will fire and it will give you your answer. Another thing that could be happening, let's go back to state-dependent learning from chapter 6. And when you have an aha moment, it could be that something in your environment, whether it's a physiological state inside your body, a psychological or emotional state inside your head, or a trigger on the outside of in your environment, could actually be a reminder or a retrieval cue for the solution to that problem or the person's name or whatever it is you're trying to come up with. And that can lead to that aha moment and problem is solved. So unfortunately, there are some barriers to problem solving. One barrier that we often use, all of these are somewhat related. One barrier that is often present in problem solving is functional fixedness. So functional fixedness involves a situation where you only see things for what they actually are. The book gives a great example of you're working in your house, maybe you're hanging pictures or something, and you need a screwdriver to screw in a screw in the wall to hang the picture. And you look and look and look and you cannot find a screwdriver. So what do? Well, for some people, it's hard to think outside of the box. So there are many different other things, as you know, that can be used as a screwdriver. Those things include maybe a butter knife that you could use for a screwdriver, or maybe even a small coin that you could use for a screwdriver. But sometimes it's hard for some of us to think outside of the box and to see things to have multiple uses than what they were actually made for. And this is based on a mental set. Mental sets involve whenever we use only problem-solving patterns that have worked for us in the past. So that mental set is created, and once again, we're not thinking outside of the box. Oftentimes, functional fixedness and mental sets are enhanced because of confirmation biases. In the past, we know what has worked for us, and we typically won't, once again, think outside of the box in order to solve the problem. We're stuck in this idea that we can only use what has worked for us in the past. So let's talk about creativity. Most people that are creative actually do think outside of the box, more so than others. I have 3 younger brothers, and each of my younger brothers are extremely creative. One of them actually went to the KD School of Arts for acting. He's an amazing artist as far as painting and drawing, and his wife is as well. I have some of their work in my house. I don't think that I have time to go grab it and show you guys, but they are both so amazing. And then my other 2 brothers, one of them actually was a tattoo artist at one time. Both of the Tyler and Logan are also they were involved in I forgot what it's called, and I hate that I forgot what it's called, but the legal graffiti. I don't know. I can't remember what that's called, but they can just draw amazing things. They are musicians and so creative. I, on the other hand, am not. It's funny because I am the oldest out of my siblings. I am the only girl out of my siblings, and I am the least creative. I think more algorithmically, like mathematically, scientific. Um, my brothers are very creative. Um, so my brothers have a tendency to be able to think outside of the box, whereas I am like stuck in this functional fixedness and this mental set. It's really hard for me to often think outside of the box. Unfortunately, I do not like that about myself, but it is a fact. Oftentimes when we look at creative thinking, creative thinkers, creative people are often divergent thinkers. This means that they can come up with more than one solution to a problem. I am more of a convergent thinker. I usually have one answer, one way to get there. And like I said, I keep repeating myself when I say I don't often think outside of the box like my little brothers do. So I've always been a little bit envious of my brothers when it comes to their creativeness. Now, the one thing that I will say about all four of us when it comes to our cognition and the way we think, although they are extremely creative, we are all very good at something. We all actually have an above average IQ score. So what does that mean? Well, first of all, we need to define intelligence. So if I were to ask you, and I am going to ask you to take just a second, and I want you to think about how you personally would define intelligence. Not necessarily what's on the screen, but how would you personally define intelligence? So I'm sure that all of you have come up with some amazing answers on how to define intelligence. Unfortunately, or fortunately, I don't know, we need a way to define intelligence, okay? And so the book, as you can see, defines intelligence as the ability to learn from one's experiences. Okay, so let's think about that. If I were to say, if I were to compare my intelligence with the intelligence of someone from a different country, does that mean that one of us is smarter than the other? Not necessarily. Let me go back to my little brothers, okay? So there's four of us. There's me, I'm the oldest by 8 years. My next little brother is Tyler. He is 8 years younger than me. And then there's Caleb, who's 9 years younger than me. And there's Logan, who is 11 years younger than me. So we're all grown now, of course, and we all have our own lives going on. And as I said before, we all have an above average intelligence. So first of all, let's look at what an above average intelligence is. When we look at intelligence is measured on the bell curve, okay? So this is a bell curve. IQ is measured on the bell curve. The average IQ theoretically is 100. So 95% of the population have an IQ score between 70 and 130. So, but 95% of the population have an IQ score between 70 and 130. So if we look at that, that's actually 2 standard deviations from the mean. A standard deviation for IQ is 15. So 66 or 7% of the population has an IQ score within 1 standard deviation of the mean, which means that 67% of the population has an IQ score between 85 and 115. 95% of the population has an IQ score between 70 and 130 within 2 standard deviations of the mean. So anything below 70 is considered a mental disability. Anything above 130 is considered gifted, okay? So that means that, you know, there are many different influences on IQ. First of all, let's look at genetics. Genetics, we do inherit part of our IQ naturally through genetics. So my little brothers and I all have half of the same genetic makeup because we have the same dad, but they have a different mom than I do. Our dad is also extremely intelligent, okay, has an above average IQ. So we all have the potential to have a high IQ, okay? But there are also influences outside of genetics or nature that influence our IQ. So our environment also influences our IQ, and these are nurture influences. So why are Tyler, Caleb, and Logan more creative than I am? Why am I more of a mathematical, scientific thinker, whereas they are very theoretical and very creative? Okay, one reason could be that we have different moms. So genetically, they could have inherited more of a creative gene than I have. The second reason is they were raised in a different environment than I was. I did not grow up with them. I am actually considered in my family in a generation above my little brothers. Like I am on the same generation as my aunts and uncles because I'm the oldest grandchild. I'm not far in age from my aunts and uncles. And my little brothers are significantly younger than me. So we grew up at different times. Also in different environments. They grew up in one household and I grew up in another household. So, and they also have a different mom than I do. So there are many, there is a genetic influence and there are many environmental factors that will influence our genetics. Okay, so yes, whenever we look at intelligence, IQ, we typically will take an IQ or an intelligence test to measure our intelligence. However, it is important to understand that IQ tests are not necessarily, I mean, we try very hard to standardize all IQ tests, okay? So this means that they are going to account for various biases and things of that nature. But let me ask you this question. If you were born and raised, my animals are being crazy. Hey, Tip, if you were born and raised like me in West Texas, okay, then it would make sense for all of us to take the same IQ test. But some of you may even be from a different country, okay? So is it fair for you to come to the United States, to Cisco, Texas, or to Abilene, Texas, and for your IQ to be compared to my IQ based on an IQ test that was created here in Texas? I would say not necessarily, because if we go back up to the definition of intelligence, we see that intelligence is defined as the ability to learn from one's experiences, acquire knowledge that's going to be based on your own culture and society, and to use resources effectively in adapting new situations or solving problems. So when they created an IQ test, the first IQ test was created to delineate between various school-age children, okay? So they decided that some children needed more help with their education than others. So they created this IQ test. So Okay, whatever. Well, as far as education is concerned, maybe that is needed. However, Benet, whenever he created this test, said, you know what? You have to be very careful with these tests. You should not use an IQ test to um, basically judge another person. Okay, so we can use it in the school system to know where we need to, or in the education system to know which students need more help than others. But we can't say, oh, well, and they actually did this. They actually labeled children that took this first IQ test as imbeciles, idiots, and morons. Okay, these are three types of words that we do not want to discuss in today's society because they are very harsh and very demeaning to someone. So, but they did. That's what they did. They used this IQ test to categorize these students. That is unfortunate. So, anyways, we have to understand, and I want you guys to understand that we can look at IQ and intelligence all day long, but that really does not necessarily mean if you take an IQ test, it means something, but it doesn't mean something. Okay, so if I cannot take an IQ test. I probably could not go to Africa, where the culture is so different, and score high on an IQ test there, because that is a different world. It's a different culture. It's a different society. So we have to remember that all IQ tests do contain a little bit of bias, regardless of what we try to do. Okay, we also have to look at how we define intelligence. There are many ways to define intelligence, and I would venture to say that when you were watching this video and I asked you to define intelligence just a little bit ago, I would venture to say that each of you came up with your own definition of intelligence. So Charles Spearman came up with a theory of intelligence that says intelligence consists of two different factors. The G factor, which is general knowledge, the ability to reason and solve problems. This is what an IQ test measures, is the G factor. You may have also heard IQ referred to as your G score. The S factor is your ability to excel in certain areas or specific intelligences. So if we look at this theory, Spearman's theory of intelligence, and we look at the entire world, all of us, I would venture to say that each of you are going to school, they're taking classes right now to reach a goal of something. And whether maybe there's a group of you, a bunch of you out there that are going to be a nurse. You know, you're going to nursing school. Well, we need nurses. Of course we need nurses. Maybe there's, you know, some of you that are going to school to be a psychologist, like I have done. Well, we need psychologists out there. However, some folks are coming to Cisco right now and going through our welding program or our firefighter program, and we need all of those people. So although you may have a high IQ score, that only measures your G factors. We have to look at how people excel in specific areas in order for the entire world to go around. Okay, so then we can also look at Gardner. Gardner came up with a theory of intelligence that emphasizes 9 different types of intelligences. So let's look at these 2 tables that contain these 9 types of intelligences. And I want each of you to think about which of these intelligences you are high in, verbal or linguistic, your ability to use language. I think that I'm a little bit high in that as far as writing things, okay? Musical intelligence. Sure, some of you have an amazing musical ability, and I envy you. I have 0 musical intelligence, okay? Logical, mathematical, the ability to think logically and to solve problems. I'm higher in that. I'm a mathematical thinker, algorithmic thinker. visual and spatial, the ability to understand how objects are oriented in space. My roommate from college, we're going to kill each other. I babysit my ex-husband's dog every day, Mia. She's amazing, and she's a big Rottweiler, and she's scared of my cats. So anyways, that's what's going on in the background. Okay, so it's funny. My roommate from college, her husband is a pilot. I definitely hope that he's high in visual and spatial intelligence. Come here, Mia. Let's see if we can see Mia. This is Mia. She's the sweetest little dog. I think she's about 4. So she stays with me every day while Kyle goes to work. Okay, so movement. This is the ability to control one's body and motions. So I'm going to tell you right now, in the scheme of things, I know that athletics probably isn't that important, but in our little world, it is very important. So I've talked about it so many times in the past. My daughter is an amazing athlete. She plays softball, and she plays volleyball, and she's a cheerleader. And then, you know, when basketball comes around, she'll be playing basketball. But our life pretty much, 10 months out of the year revolves around softball. She's an amazing athlete. It is important for athletes to be high in movement intelligence, or what we might also call kinesiology. Interpersonal intelligence is when you are sensitive to others. You know, you can read others' emotions, can read others' motives, things of that nature. A psychologist is going to need to be high in interpersonal intelligence. Intrapersonal intelligence is also very similar to emotional intelligence. This is when you can understand your own emotions. And the funny thing is, they have found that emotional intelligence actually is going to correlate with success more so than your G factor or IQ score. And naturalistic intelligence involves looking at nature. The guy that I'm dating right now is like blows my mind, because we will be out somewhere, if, you know, wherever we are, and he just looks at plants and he can tell you the name of the plant. He can tell you if the plant, he'll say, we were at a hotel a couple of weeks ago, and he was like, this tree shouldn't be planted here. And he went on to tell me what kind of tree it was, why it should not have been planted, where it was planting. He said something about the roots grow shallow, so it was going to break up all of the cement that it was growing around. I was just like flabbergasted. I'm like, I don't know anything about that. That's awesome. Something else, naturalistic intelligence. As you can see here, farmers, landscapers, biologists, and botanists. But also, my uncle is a wildlife game manager. So he needs to be able to look at the patterns of the animals that are, you know, on the ranch. I mean, I'm not even going to try to pretend that I know what I'm talking about, but something about, you know, how many bucks and does need to be taken off of the ranch each year in order for the species to thrive on the ranch, and you know, things like that. So Keesley and I just went and got our hunting license the other day, and they ask you when you get your hunting license, like how many certain birds you took last year, and because they need that information. Naturalistic intelligence, wildlife game managers, and people like that need to know the populations of the different species of animals in order to set limits and things like that, so that we don't, so that number one, they don't become overpopulated, and number two, they don't become extinct. So that's a good balance. Existential intelligence is looking at the big picture, knowing the reason for existence. So with this, I'm going to plug my favorite book again. Heard me talk about it in the past. It's called Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. It talks about existentialism. It talks about his time in a concentration camp and how he had to pick meaning out of life based on these horrific circumstances. I always refer back to this book. He says that there's two emotions that govern our existence, and those are love and suffering. He also says that suffering is like a vapor. I love this saying. Suffering is like a vapor, no matter how big or how small, it encompasses the soul. So there are many different tidbits of information that you could take out of Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. I encourage all of you to read that if you get the chance. It is just an amazing book. Another theory of intelligence is Sternberg's triarchic theory. So he proposes three kinds of intelligences: the analytical, which is kind of like the G factor, creative, and practical. Practical intelligence is more of your street smarts. Something else that correlates with success is practical intelligence or street smarts. So the saying goes, you can have all of the knowledge in the world with this analytical intelligence, but if you don't know how to use it, which is practical intelligence, then it's not going to do you any good. So it's interesting. Okay, so we've talked about all of this IQ test. Let's look at language. Language is a system for combining symbols, such as words, so that an unlimited number of meaningful statements can be made for the purpose of communicating. Language is a cognitive process. So something very interesting happened to me a few years ago. Whenever I was teaching, I had a student that was from a different country, and English was his second language. So I noticed that he was struggling a little bit in class. So let's go back to intelligence. Does that mean that he had a low IQ? Absolutely not. He is coming into my classroom. English is his second language. He had just learned English, and he is having to sit there and listen to me lecture. You guys probably know by now that I talk fast, okay? I lecture fast, I talk fast. I have I guess a Southern accent a little bit. So sometimes I might be a little bit hard to understand, or when I'm speaking, I don't always put words together correctly because I'm Southern. So I noticed he was struggling a little bit. And after class one day, he stayed, and, you know, I was talking to him a little bit about what was going on. And we had a long and meaningful conversation. So basically what I got from the conversation is this, and some of you that are from a different country or English is your second language, you may be experiencing this as well, okay? So when he sits in class, in lecture, he listens to me speaking English. So I'm speaking English to him, or even if he's reading his textbook, trying to get the information out, he's reading it in English. So for him to understand, to truly understand what was going on or what is being said, the concepts that are being illustrated through my Southern accent English language, he had to translate what I was saying or what the book is saying into his native language. Okay, that's one cognitive process that has to occur for him in class. Okay, and then in order to respond to this English language that he has had to translate into his own language, he comes up with the answer or the response in his native language. Okay, but in order for him to portray his thinking, he had to translate his thinking in his native language into English, and then he had to talk to me or write an assignment, a discussion assignment, or answer a test. Okay, so many different cognitive processes are occurring in this little bit of a span of time. So I totally understood at that point why he was struggling in my class. So I tried to make it a point from then on out to work especially hard with him to help him to understand, because he had a very high intelligence, IQ score, if you will, but there was that barrier, that cognitive barrier of having to translate so much because he did not fully understand the English language. I've also been told, I don't know what truth there is to this, but I've also been told that English is one of the hardest languages to learn because of all of our different rules. So speaking of rules, grammar is the system of rules that govern the structure and use of our language, okay? So now let's break language down furthermore. Phonemes are the basic units of sound in language. Morphemes are the smallest units. So morphemes are words that have meaning. Syntax is the system of rules for combining words into sentences. So syntax are sentences. Semantics determine the meaning of the words, okay? And then pragmatics, I think, is probably one of the most important parts of language, is the practical ways of communicating with others, the social niceties of language. In other words, so when you're sitting in psychology class, if you may talk differently than if you're out hanging out with your friends. If you go in for a job interview, then you may talk differently than if you're hanging out with your mom and dad. So that's what pragmatics is. Now, the interesting thing about language, and this goes back to my student that was from a different country, is two different theories that look at language. The linguistic relativity hypothesis says that thought processes are controlled by the languages we speak. Okay, so that actually would have been so much more difficult going back to my student, because that means that because we speak two different languages, our thought processes are different. Okay, so actually the linguistic relativity hypothesis doesn't hold much weight. More so, the cognitive universalism theory is more supported. It says that concepts are universal and actually influence the development of language. So we know that the second is truer. And one thing that I'll go ahead and talk about here, it will actually be looking at in chapter 8, is the development of language. So if we look at the development of language across cultures, like no matter what language that you speak, no matter what society or culture you live in, we see that the development of language is universal. So like at 2 months, for instance, babies are cooing. They're making noises, regardless of what language they will speak. By 6 months, we are seeing babies babble. And at 6 months, the interesting thing is that a baby can is physically, if development is normal, at 6 months old, a baby is physically capable of making every sound necessary for the language that he or she will speak. Oh, and I also wanted to mention, like, even deaf children at 6 months old will babble in sign language. So that's interesting. I actually have a friend, talked about softball just a little bit ago, about my daughter playing softball for Showtime. So she is on a team called Showtime West Texas Ellis. And she has a teammate named Bailey. And Bailey has a little sister who is deaf. She actually has, she was born deaf, and she actually has implants. So she's interesting to me because of this whole psychology thing. So sometimes she speaks, with her implant, she can actually hear very well, and she also speaks pretty well as well. So, but sometimes when she's speaking verbally with her mouth. She's also babbling with her hands. And I think that it's so interesting. And the funny thing is I think this means fart. And I know that's funny, whatever, but she does that all the time. She's like, I farted or something. It's so funny, but she cracks me up, and she's amazing to me, and her parents are amazing to me, and her sister is amazing to me to watch them and how they deal with Gracie throughout life. So it's so fun. It's so interesting. Usually by 1 year old, kiddos are speaking hollow phrases. Hollow phrases are one word that has an entire meaning. So this would mean like eat, would mean like, hey, mama, I'm hungry, feed me. Telegraphic speech comes around about 1.5 years. This is where a child will will speak, but will leave out like articles and things of that nature. So here's something that is so interesting to me. At 6 years old, kiddos are typically speaking whole sentences and speaking, great. But let's back up a year, 1.5 years, 2 years, 4.5 to 5 years old. A 4.5 to 5 year old kiddo is going to speak more correctly, typically, than a 6-year-old. So there are 2 theories to language development. The first theory is it's given to us by Noam Chomsky. He says that speech is biological, that we actually have a language acquisition device, and we speak based on basically genetics, that we are all pre-wired to speak in a certain way. Okay, yes, there is, if we look at cognitive universalism, if we look at the universal development of language in these different stages that we go through, that does support the fact that we are pre-wired to learn language. The second theory is, of course, looking at the behavioristic theory, that not only do we model others when we speak, and that's what's important here, when we speak correctly at 4.5 to 5, but maybe incorrectly at 6, and that we are rewarded for our language. So let me give you a couple of examples. Okay, first of all, why do we speak more correctly when we are 4.5 or 5 years old versus when we're 6? So a 4.5-year-old will say, I went to the store. They are modeling or copying what dad or mom said. Okay, I went to the store. A 6-year-old, after learning, becoming more familiar with grammar and the grammar rules and the fact that you add ed to make it past tense, a 6-year-old might say, I goed to the store, or I wented to the store. So, of course, eventually the child will learn how, the different rules and how there are exceptions to the rules. So went is past tense of go. So anyways, something else when we're learning language, according to the behavioristic theory. So let's think about, unfortunately, Casely's first word was dada, not mama, dada. And number one, looking from the genetic perspective, Noam Chomsky, dada is easier to say than mama. So all of you moms out there, if your kiddo's first word was dada, it's justified, okay? Because it's easier to say. Second of all, let's look at this. I remember the first time Casely said dada. Kyle was working. He came home. I was staying at home with Casely. It was summertime, so I was off. So he would come home every day for lunch. And the first thing that he would do was pick Casely up and sit in the chair with her, have a little bit of time with her. And of course, I remember it so vividly. They were sitting in the recliner. He was rocking her, and she said, dada. And what do you think Kyle did? He just, oh my gosh, praised her, hugged, oh, baby girl, I love you so much. So if we look at the social cognitive theory, the behavioralistic theory, not only is she modeling dada, because what did Kyle do and what did I do often? Set in her face, dad, 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 dada. So she's modeling that word. But then Kyle also rewarded her when she said dada. He was like, good job, baby girl, and rewarded her with love. Then she associates dada with that love and that praise and with her daddy. And so that's how she learned to say dada. And she did the same with mama. It was after dada, but she did do the same with mama. And just about everything else. Okay, another one of Casely's words. Of course, kiddos know who Santa Claus is for the most part. So if we look at Christmas time, Santa Claus is on Cokes. Okay, well, I am a Coke drinker. I'm drinking coffee now because it's early in the morning, but I drink Cokes, and that is my soft drink of choice. And Santa Claus is on the Coke can. So Paisley called Santa Claus Ho-Ho, and she saw Ho-Ho on the Coke can, and she associated Ho-Ho with Coke. So she called Coke for the longest time, even, after she was old enough to know better, I guess out of habit, she called Coke Ho-Ho. So, Mama Ho-Ho meant, Mama, I want some Coke. So anyways, those are some examples of language development, the two different theories that influence our language development. So we have looked today at cognition, various cognitive concepts. Remember, that is all stuff going on in our heads, thinking, however you want to look at it. And there's so many different concepts to all of this. I have not yet uploaded the document that I told you guys to go in and print out for next Tuesday's lecture. So I'm hoping to get to the office tomorrow and get that uploaded. I will not be at the office in the morning, so I will, that's why I have to take my pawpaw to the doctor, the one that has coronavirus. So I have to take him to the doctor in the morning. So anyways, you guys be looking for that. Okay, today's Wednesday, by the way. So that's why I'm recording chapter 7 today, because I won't be there tomorrow. And then on Tuesday, we will meet at 8 o'clock in the morning for chapter 8. So I will post an announcement whenever I get the chapter 8 notes uploaded for you guys to go in and print out. So if you have any questions or comments, or if you want to meet with me in a personal one-on-one Zoom, for office hours, if you will, or to discuss your grade or anything like that, email me, let me know. If we can't come up with a solution via email, then we will set up a time to meet one-on-one with Zoom. So I hope that you all have a fantastic weekend, and I will see you on Tuesday.